When Marcus pulled that dying man from the churning waters of the Atlantic, his calloused hands trembling with exhaustion, he had no idea that his entire existence was about to transform forever. And when he cast that worn net into the dark ocean one final time, convinced it would return as empty as his heart, he couldn't possibly imagine the miracle that was already unfolding beneath those waves. This is a story of faith restored, of divine intervention in the darkest hour, and of how a simple fisherman from the coast of Maine discovered that even when we abandon hope, we are never truly abandoned. Stay until the end, and you'll witness a testimony that will strengthen your soul and remind you that miracles still happen in our modern world. And don't forget to leave a like if this story touches your heart. But to understand how Marcus Thompson arrived at that life-changing moment, alone on his decrepit fishing boat, miles from shore, with tears mixing with sea spray on his weathered face, we need to go back to where the unraveling began, back to when faith still lived in his chest, before despair carved out every ounce of belief and left nothing but hollow resignation. Chantritonin. The sun hadn't yet broken over Rockport, Maine, when Marcus first sensed that something fundamental had shifted in his world. It was late September 2023, and the fishing season that should have filled his nets and his bank account had delivered nothing but salt water and broken promises. His small house on Granite Street, the one his grandfather built with his own hands 7 decades ago, sat just 3 blocks from the harbor, close enough that Marcus could smell the ocean from his front porch, close enough that the sound of gulls was his morning alarm, close enough that the sea had become both his livelihood and his tormentor. Marcus was 42 years old, though the mirror reflected someone much older. Deep lines carved through sun-damaged skin, testimony to 25 years on the water. His hands bore scars from hooks and rope burns, permanent reminders of a profession that demanded everything and recently gave back nothing. His dark hair had begun graying at the temples prematurely, accelerated by stress that gnawed at him day and night. He stood just under 6 feet tall, with the solid build of a man who'd spent his life hauling nets and battling currents, but lately that strength felt like it was evaporating, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. His wife, Sarah, had left him 16 months ago. Not for another man. Somehow, that would have been easier to accept. She left because she couldn't watch him drown anymore. That's what she said the day she packed her bags, tears streaming down her face as their daughter Emma clung to her leg. "You're drowning, Marcus, and you're pulling us under with you. I love you, but I can't save someone who won't grab the life preserver." Emma had been only 6 years old then, too young to understand why Daddy wasn't coming to their new apartment, why she could only see him every other weekend, why her world had split in two. The divorce papers arrived 3 months later. Marcus signed them without reading the details, sitting alone at his kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey he'd bought instead of groceries. That same table where his grandmother used to make blueberry pancakes every Sunday morning, where his father taught him to tie fishing knots when he was 5, where he'd proposed to Sarah on Christmas Eve 15 years ago, with candles flickering and snow falling outside the window. Now, it was just a place where bills piled up, unopened and accusing. His mother, Dorothy Thompson, lived in the same nursing home where his father had spent his final days. Seaside assisted living sat on a hill overlooking Penobscot Bay, and the cruel irony wasn't lost on Marcus. A woman who'd spent her entire life within walking distance of the ocean could now barely see it through her clouded vision. At 73, she was battling diabetes, heart disease, and early-stage dementia that stole pieces of her memory like waves eroding a shoreline. The facility cost $3,000 monthly, and Marcus's insurance covered barely half. The bills arrived with clockwork regularity, printed in clinical black and white, numbers that might as well have been death sentences. Marcus would visit her every Sunday afternoon, sitting in the sterile room that smelled of disinfectant and old age, holding her papery hand while she drifted in and out of lucidity. Sometimes she knew him, called him by name, asked about Emma with tears in her faded blue eyes. Other times she thought he was his father, young and healthy, asking when they'd go dancing again. Those moments broke something inside him that he didn't know how to repair. His father, Robert Thompson, had died 5 years earlier from lung cancer, 40 years of smoking finally catching up with him. He'd spent his last months in this same building, in a room 2 floors down, and Marcus had watched the strongest man he'd ever known reduced to skin and bones, coughing blood into tissues while apologizing for being a burden. The fishing business, Thompson & Son Marine Supplies, had been in Marcus's family for 3 generations. His great-grandfather started it in 1948, right after World War II, with a single boat and a dream. By the time Marcus's father took over, they had 4 boats and employed 6 men from the community. Marcus grew up on those boats, learning the trade from men with faces like leather and hearts full of sea stories. He'd taken over the business 10 years ago when his father's health began failing, and he'd been determined to honor that legacy, to prove himself worthy of the Thompson name painted on the side of each vessel. But the ocean, it seemed, had other plans. It started subtly, a season that was merely disappointing rather than disastrous. The lobster catches were down, but everyone in Rockport experienced the same. Climate change, they said. Water temperatures shifting. Migration patterns changing. Marcus told himself it was temporary, that the sea was cyclical, that good years and bad years were part of the rhythm he'd grown up with. He borrowed money to upgrade his equipment, convinced that newer technology would solve the problem. $20,000 in loans, secured against the house his grandfather built. Then came the storm. Hurricane Eleanor swept up the coast in October of 2022. A Category 2 that wasn't supposed to hit Maine directly, but changed course at the last moment. 2 of Marcus's 4 boats were destroyed, smashed against the dock like matchsticks despite every precaution. His insurance covered some of the loss, but not all. Never all. He was left with 2 boats, one of which needed extensive repairs he couldn't afford. The men he employed had families to feed, so he had to let them go, watching their faces as he delivered the news, seeing his own failure reflected in their eyes. He sold 1 boat to cover immediate debts. That left him with just the Mary Catherine, named after his grandmother, a 32-foot commercial fishing vessel that had seen better days. She was reliable but aging, her engine temperamental, her hull showing rust spots that Marcus patched himself because he couldn't afford a proper dry dock. She became both his last hope and his prison, the only thing standing between his family legacy and complete dissolution. The catches got worse. Week after week, Marcus would motor out into the Atlantic before dawn, sometimes alone, sometimes with his old friend Tommy Rodriguez, helping when work at the shipyard was slow. They'd set nets and traps, following the patterns Marcus had learned from his father, the secret spots that were supposed to be reliable. And week after week, they'd haul up nets that were nearly empty. A few cod, some undersized haddock they'd have to throw back, Maybe a couple of lobsters if they were lucky. Nothing close to what he needed to make payments on the house, the business loans, his mother's care, the child support for Emma. The other fishermen in Rockport were struggling too, but not like Marcus. Somehow they managed to bring in enough to survive, to keep their boats running and their families fed. Marcus began to wonder if he was cursed, if the sea itself had turned against him personally. He'd wake at 3 in the morning, heart pounding with anxiety, staring at the ceiling and calculating numbers that never added up. How many more weeks until the bank foreclosed? How long until they evicted his mother from Seaside? What would happen to Emma if he lost everything? He stopped going to church. First, he just missed a few Sundays, sleeping through the alarm because he'd been up all night worrying. Then weeks became months, and he realized he couldn't sit in those pews anymore. Couldn't sing hymns about God's provision and divine care when his nets came up empty and his bank account showed overdraft notices. The pastor, Reverend James Mitchell, called several times. Marcus let it go to voicemail. What could he say? That he felt abandoned? That prayer seemed like talking to an empty sky? That faith felt like a luxury for people whose lives weren't falling apart? Sarah took Emma to services now, he'd heard. His daughter probably thought he'd stopped believing, stopped caring about the things they used to share. She was 7 now, in 2nd grade, learning to read chapter books and asking questions about the world that deserved better answers than her father could provide. During his court-mandated visits every other weekend, she'd look at him with those enormous brown eyes, Sarah's eyes, and ask if he was okay. A 7-year-old shouldn't have to worry about her father, but Emma was perceptive, sensitive, old enough to sense the weight crushing him even if she couldn't articulate it. The child support was 3 months overdue. 3 months. Marcus had received a letter from Sarah's attorney 2 weeks ago, formal and cold, outlining potential legal consequences. He knew Sarah didn't want to do this. She'd probably resisted as long as possible. But she had bills too, and Emma needed things. School supplies, winter clothes she'd outgrown, the basic necessities of childhood that Marcus could no longer provide. The shame of that failure ate at him like acid. His refrigerator contained a half-empty jar of peanut butter, some bread going stale, and a few cans of soup. He'd stopped buying groceries he didn't absolutely need, surviving on coffee and whatever he could catch and cook himself. He'd lost 15 pounds over the past few months, his clothes hanging looser, his belt cinched tighter. Tommy's wife, Maria, kept inviting him for dinner, and sometimes Marcus accepted because the alternative was going to bed hungry. But accepting charity, even from friends, felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that he couldn't take care of himself anymore. The bills covered his kitchen table like a paper avalanche. Mortgage payment, $2,400, 2 months past due. Business loan, $850 monthly, 3 months overdue. Electric bill, $230. Water and sewage, $95. Phone, $60. Boat insurance, $300 monthly. Fuel for the Mary Catherine. Costs that varied but averaged $300 weekly when he could afford to go out. His mother's nursing home balance, $4,500 outstanding after insurance. And the child support, $900 monthly, multiplied by 3 months of arrears. He'd started receiving foreclosure warnings from the bank, official letters with legal terminology that made his hands shake when he opened them. They were giving him 60 days to bring the mortgage current, or they'd begin proceedings. 60 days to find nearly $5,000, plus whatever accumulated in late fees and penalties. Where was he supposed to find that kind of money? Robbing a bank seemed more realistic than pulling it from the ocean. His credit cards were maxed out. His credit score had plummeted. He'd tried applying for personal loans from every institution in a 50-mile radius and been rejected by all of them. Too much debt, too little income, too high risk. He'd even considered selling the house, but he owed more on the mortgage than it was worth in the current market. And besides, where would he go? This house was the last piece of his father, his grandfather, the family history that defined him. Some nights, sitting alone on his porch, with the sound of waves in the distance, Marcus would think about just walking into the ocean and not coming back. Not actively suicidal. He'd never put Emma through that. But passively wishing he could simply cease to exist. That all the problems would evaporate if he did. The world would be better off without him dragging everyone down. Sarah could remarry someone who'd actually provide for their daughter. His mother wouldn't know the difference in her fog of dementia. The business debt would die with him. Everyone's problems would be solved. But he couldn't do it. Some stubborn core of Thompson resilience kept him moving forward, kept him waking up every morning and forcing himself to try again. His father had raised him with a work ethic that didn't allow for quitting, that insisted real men faced their problems head-on and fought until there was nothing left to fight with. So Marcus kept fighting, even though he'd stopped believing the fight could be won. Tommy tried to help. God bless Tommy Rodriguez. They'd been friends since elementary school, had served together in the Coast Guard before Marcus took over the family business. Tommy worked as a welder at the Bath Iron Works shipyard, steady employment with union benefits, the kind of security Marcus had thrown away by staying in fishing. Tommy would show up at the dock at 4 in the morning on his days off, insisting on crewing for free, splitting whatever tiny catch they managed, even though Marcus protested. "Brothers don't keep score," Tommy would say, his stocky frame and easy smile a stark contrast to Marcus's defeated slouch. But even Tommy's optimism was wearing thin. Last week, after another disastrous outing that netted them maybe $50 worth of cod, Tommy had sat on the deck of the Mary Catherine and said quietly, "Marcus, maybe it's time to think about getting out. Find something else. This isn't working, brother. It's killing you." And maybe Tommy was right. Maybe the smart thing would be to declare bankruptcy, let the bank take the house, find some job at a warehouse or a gas station, start over from nothing at 42 years old with no skills except fishing. But that felt like betraying everyone who'd come before him. His great-grandfather who'd started with nothing and built something real. His grandfather who'd expanded the business during good times and survived the bad. His father who'd passed the legacy down with trust and pride, believing Marcus was worthy. How could he be the Thompson who gave up? Who let the family name sink beneath the waves after 75 years of survival? The people in Rockport knew. Small coastal towns don't keep secrets. Everyone knew Marcus Thompson was drowning financially, that his boats were gone, that his wife had left, that he was barely hanging on. He could see it in their faces at the grocery store, the mixture of pity and discomfort. Some people crossed the street to avoid awkward conversations. Others offered the kind of hollow encouragement that made everything worse. "Hang in there, Marcus. Things'll turn around." How? How would they turn around? The fish weren't coming back. His luck wasn't changing. Prayer hadn't worked. Hard work hadn't worked. Nothing worked. He'd started avoiding the harbor during busy times, unable to watch other fishermen unloading decent catches while his boat sat empty. Jerry Morrison, who ran Coastal Seafood, had been a friend of his father's, and lately Jerry wouldn't meet Marcus's eyes when they crossed paths. Marcus owed him money, too. Nearly $2,000 in fees for dock space and ice and equipment rental from before things got desperate. Jerry hadn't pushed for payment, which somehow made it worse. Charity. Pity. The look that said, "Poor Marcus Thompson, fallen so far." His mother's condition was worsening. Dr. Patel at Seaside had called him in for a meeting 3 weeks ago, explaining gently that Dorothy was declining faster than expected. The dementia was progressing, and she'd need to move to the memory care wing soon, which would cost an additional $1,000 monthly. Money that might as well have been $1 million. Marcus had sat in that conference room with its inspirational posters about aging with dignity and wanted to scream. How was he supposed to provide dignity when he couldn't even pay the basic bills? During his last visit, his mother had been having a good day. She knew him, held his hand, and said, "Your father would be so proud of you, Marcus. Keeping the business going, taking care of everyone. You're a good son." He'd nearly broken down crying right there, because his father wouldn't be proud. His father would be ashamed that Marcus had failed so spectacularly, that he'd let the business collapse, that he'd lost his family. But he just squeezed her hand and said, "Thanks, Ma. I'm trying." And that wasn't even a lie. He was trying. Trying was all he had left. Emma's birthday was coming up in 3 weeks. November 15th. She'd be 8 years old. Sarah had texted him asking what he wanted to contribute to the party she was planning. Marcus stared at that message for an hour before responding that he'd figure something out. But what could he figure out? He had maybe $200 in his checking account, enough for fuel and basic food. Nowhere close to enough for the kind of birthday present an 8-year-old deserved. He'd probably end up at a thrift store looking for something used that he could wrap in newspaper because he couldn't afford proper wrapping paper. Another failure to add to the mountain. The drinking had gotten worse too, though Marcus tried to hide it. Not full-blown alcoholism, he couldn't afford that, but enough to take the edge off the constant anxiety. A few beers most nights, sitting on the porch or in front of the television that only got basic channels because he'd canceled cable. Sometimes whiskey, nursing it slowly to make the bottle last, just enough to blur the sharp corners of reality, to let him sleep for a few hours without nightmares about foreclosure notices and his mother dying alone and Emma growing up thinking her father was a worthless failure. Tommy had noticed, had said something about it last week with that careful tone people use when they're worried but trying not to judge. "You doing okay, Marcus? I mean, really okay?" And Marcus had laughed bitterly and said, "Define okay, Tommy. I'm alive. My heart's still beating. That's about all I've got." Tommy had looked like he wanted to say more but didn't, and the silence between them felt heavy with all the things neither of them knew how to fix. The nights were the worst. Lying in bed in the house that was falling apart around him, the porch steps rotting, paint peeling, a leak in the upstairs bathroom he couldn't afford to repair, Marcus would stare at the ceiling and try to remember when he'd last felt truly happy. Emma's birth, maybe, holding that tiny, perfect human and feeling like his life had purpose and meaning. Or his wedding day, Sarah in her simple white dress, dancing in the backyard of this very house while string lights twinkled and their friends celebrated. Those moments felt like they'd happened to someone else, a different Marcus, who still believed good things were possible. He'd stopped making plans for the future because the future looked like an abyss. No dreams of expanding the business again. No fantasies about reconciling with Sarah. She'd moved on, was apparently dating someone who worked at the hospital in Bath. Someone stable and reliable. No hope of being the father Emma deserved. Just the grinding reality of trying to survive one more day, one more week, one more month, before everything collapsed completely. The sea had been his whole life. His earliest memory was sitting on his father's lap while the boat rocked gently, learning to distinguish between the different types of gulls by their calls. He'd taken his first steps on a rolling deck. He'd proposed to Sarah on a sunset cruise. He'd imagined teaching Emma to fish when she was old enough, passing down the knowledge and love for the ocean that defined the Thompson family. But now the sea felt like an enemy, withholding its bounty, punishing him for sins he couldn't name. He'd tried changing his fishing locations, experimenting with different techniques, consulting with other fishermen who were more successful. Nothing helped. It was like the fish actively avoided his nets, like the ocean itself was rejecting him. Superstitious nonsense, he knew. But when you're desperate enough, you start believing in curses and bad luck and divine punishment. Maybe God was punishing him for his lack of faith. Maybe this was what happened when you stopped praying. The universe stopped caring whether you survived. Last month, Marcus had done something he swore he'd never do. He'd gone to the First Community Church's food pantry. Not to the main entrance where people could see him, but around back during off hours, and he'd filled out the anonymous form requesting assistance. 3 days later, a box of canned goods and dried pasta appeared on his porch with no note, no identification. Just silent charity from people who probably prayed for him, another lost sheep who needed saving. He'd cried while unpacking that box, sitting on his kitchen floor with tears of shame and gratitude mixing together. The isolation was crushing. He'd pushed away most of his friends because he couldn't handle their success, their normal lives, their inability to understand what it felt like to lose everything. Sarah had their mutual friends now. Marcus had been the one to move out, to disappear from their social circles. His mother didn't recognize him half the time. Emma was too young to really talk to about his problems. Tommy was still there, but even Tommy's patience had to have limits. Marcus felt like he was on an island, surrounded by dark water, watching the tide rise while everyone else stood safely on shore. And through it all, the bills kept coming. The phone calls from debt collectors kept increasing. The official letters with legal warnings kept arriving. The clock kept ticking down toward foreclosure, toward eviction, toward the final collapse that seemed inevitable. Marcus Thompson, 42 years old, fisherman from a family of fishermen, father to a daughter who deserved better, son to a mother who was forgetting who he was, drowning slowly while the whole town watched. But he kept going out on the water. Every day the weather allowed, Marcus would wake before dawn, drink instant coffee that tasted like mud, and drive his beat-up Ford truck to the harbor. He'd prep the Mary Catherine, checking fuel levels, examining nets, saying a prayer he didn't believe in anymore, and head out into the Atlantic. Sometimes with Tommy, usually alone, always hoping that maybe today would be different. Maybe today the nets would come up full. Maybe today God would remember he existed. They never did. The nets came up empty, or close enough to empty that it made no difference, and each failure carved deeper into his soul, each wasted day of fuel and effort pushing him closer to the edge. But what else could he do? This was all he knew. This was who he was. A Thompson. A fisherman. A man who'd rather drown trying than give up and float away. He hadn't told anyone, but yesterday Marcus had taken his father's old revolver out of the safe, cleaned it, loaded it, and stared at it for 2 hours. Not making plans, not really, just considering options, thinking about insurance policies and whether Emma would be better off with the payout than with a father who'd failed her so completely. He'd eventually put the gun back, disgusted with himself, but the thought lingered. The knowledge that he had that option, that there was a door out of this nightmare if things got bad enough. But not yet. Not while his mother was still alive and might have moments of clarity where she'd ask for him. Not while Emma still lit up when she saw him on weekends, still hugged him tight and said, "Love you, Daddy," without any understanding of how close he was to falling apart. Not while Tommy kept showing up at 4 in the morning with thermoses of real coffee and that stubborn optimism that refused to die. Not yet. So Marcus kept going through the motions. Wake up. Coffee. Harbor. Ocean. Empty nets. Return. Avoid people. Drink just enough to sleep. Repeat. A life reduced to survival mode, to putting one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant acknowledging the complete and total failure of everything he'd tried to build. The weather forecast for tomorrow looked rough. Storm system moving in from the northeast, 15-foot seas, small craft advisory. Smart fishermen would stay in port. But Marcus needed to try. The mortgage company had sent another notice. His mother's facility had called about the overdue balance. Sarah's attorney had sent a follow-up letter, more formal, more threatening. He had to do something. Had to try one more time, even if the odds were 0. Even if he was just going through motions that didn't matter anymore. Because what else did he have? This was his last stand. His final attempt to pull something from the ocean before it swallowed him completely. And deep down, in a place he didn't like to examine, Marcus Thompson had stopped expecting anything good to happen. He'd stopped believing in miracles, in answered prayers, in divine intervention. The universe had made its position clear. He was on his own, and he was losing. Tomorrow morning, before dawn, he'd take the Mary Catherine out one more time. Alone, because he couldn't ask Tommy to risk his safety in a storm. He'd motor into those gray Atlantic waters, cast his nets with hands that had given up hope, and wait for the inevitable empty results. And then, he didn't know what came after that. Bankruptcy, probably. Foreclosure. Losing his mother's care. Watching everything his family built dissolve into nothing. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, sitting on his rotting porch with a beer going warm in his hand, Marcus just existed. Listening to waves crash against rocks he couldn't see in the darkness. Wondering how his life had arrived at this point. Remembering a version of himself who'd believed in things, who'd had faith, who'd thought hard work and integrity mattered. That man felt like a stranger now, someone naive and foolish who didn't understand how the world really worked. The stars were out, sharp and cold in the October sky. His father used to tell him that fishermen had a special relationship with stars, that they guided you home when everything else was dark. But Marcus couldn't see any guidance in them anymore. They were just distant lights, unreachable and indifferent, burning in a universe that didn't care whether Marcus Thompson lived or died, succeeded or failed, kept trying or gave up entirely. He finished his beer, crushed the can, and went inside to try to sleep. Tomorrow would come whether he was ready or not. The ocean would be waiting. The nets would be empty. And life would continue its slow, grinding process of breaking him down completely. But he'd go anyway. Because he was Marcus Thompson, and Thompsons didn't quit. Even when quitting would be smarter. Even when fighting was pointless. Even when hope was dead, and faith was gone, and nothing made sense anymore. He'd go out on that water one more time, cast those nets one more time, and when they came up empty again, he'd have to figure out what came next. The storm arrived exactly as predicted. By 4 o'clock in the morning on October 23rd, the wind was howling through Rockport like a wounded animal, rattling windows and bending trees. Rain came in sheets, nearly horizontal, drumming against Marcus's bedroom window with enough force to wake him from the shallow sleep he'd finally achieved around 2. He lay there for a moment, listening to the storm rage, and almost let himself stay in bed. The smart thing would be to stay in port, wait it out, try again tomorrow. But tomorrow would bring the same bills, the same failure, the same emptiness. At least if he tried today, he'd be doing something. At least he wouldn't be passively accepting defeat. Marcus dressed in the dark, thermal underwear, jeans worn soft from years of saltwater exposure, 2 layers of flannel shirts, his waterproof jacket that wasn't quite as waterproof as it used to be. He pulled on his rubber boots, grabbed his thermos of instant coffee, and headed out into the storm. The wind nearly ripped the front door from his hands. Rain pelted his face like needles. This was absolutely insane, and he knew it. But insanity had become normal lately. The drive to the harbor took twice as long as usual, his windshield wipers barely keeping up with the deluge, the roads slick and treacherous. Rockport Harbor looked apocalyptic in the pre-dawn darkness. Boats straining against their moorings, water surging over the docks, rigging clanging against masts in a discordant symphony. The Mary Catherine bobbed violently, and Marcus had to time his jump from dock to deck carefully to avoid being pitched into the churning water. He should have turned back. Every instinct screamed that this was dangerous, that the risk far outweighed any potential reward. But Marcus had stopped listening to that voice of reason weeks ago. He fired up the engine. It caught on the 3rd try, thank God, and began the process of casting off. The ropes were soaked and difficult to handle with numb fingers. Waves crashed over the bow as he maneuvered out of the harbor, and for a moment, Marcus wondered if he'd even make it past the breakwater. But the Mary Catherine was a tough old boat, and she pushed through, engine roaring, hull pounding against swells that seemed impossibly large. Once they cleared the harbor entrance, the full force of the storm hit them. 15-foot seas were an understatement. Some of these waves had to be pushing 20 feet, massive walls of gray-green water that lifted the boat like a toy and dropped it with spine-jarring impacts. Spray came over the sides constantly, soaking everything, the taste of salt water strong in Marcus's mouth. He should turn back. He knew he should turn back. This wasn't bravery. This was stupidity bordering on suicidal. But Marcus kept pushing forward, fighting the wheel, riding the waves, moving farther from shore into the storm-tossed Atlantic. Maybe some part of him didn't care if he came back. Maybe this was a passive form of the decision he'd avoided last night with his father's gun. Let the ocean make the choice for him. Let nature decide whether Marcus Thompson deserved to survive. 2 hours into the journey, miles from shore, the storm reached its peak intensity. The sky was nearly black, despite the fact that the sun should be rising somewhere beyond those clouds. Rain came down so hard that Marcus could barely see the bow of his own boat. Waves broke over the cabin, and he had to secure himself to avoid being washed overboard. The Mary Catherine's engine strained but held, and Marcus felt a surge of love for this old boat, that had seen his family through generations. She was trying, just like him, still fighting even when the fight seemed pointless. He reached his intended fishing spot, a location about 12 miles offshore where his father had always found success, and began preparing his nets. It was nearly impossible work in these conditions. The wind kept ripping everything from his hands. The deck was slick with water. Waves threatened to sweep him overboard with every swell. But Marcus had been doing this since he was a teenager, and muscle memory took over where conscious thought couldn't function. He cast the first net, watching it disappear into the dark water. Then the second, the third, working methodically despite the chaos around him, because this was what he knew how to do. This was his identity, even if it had stopped working, even if the ocean had turned against him. He was Marcus Thompson, and Marcus Thompson was a fisherman. The boat rose and fell, a sickening rhythm that would have made most people violently seasick. Marcus's stomach had long ago adjusted to these motions, but today even he felt queasy. Or maybe that was just despair. Hard to tell the difference anymore. He let the nets sit for 30 minutes, huddled in the cabin while the storm raged outside. This was the moment he normally used to pray, back when he believed prayer mattered. His father would always say a blessing over the nets, asking God to provide, expressing gratitude for whatever came up. Marcus tried to remember the words, but they stuck in his throat. What was the point? God wasn't listening. God hadn't listened in months. Why would today be different? Instead, he just sat there, cold and wet and exhausted, watching the storm through the cabin window and wondering what he'd do when the nets came up empty again. There had to be a point where you admitted defeat, where you accepted that sometimes you lose, sometimes dreams die, sometimes families fail. Maybe that point was today. Maybe after this final attempt, he'd motor back to shore, dock the Mary Catherine for the last time, and start making the phone calls he'd been avoiding. The bankruptcy attorney, the bank, the nursing home administrator, Sarah's lawyer. All the people he'd been running from, denying reality, pretending something might change. The 30 minutes felt like hours. Finally, Marcus emerged back into the storm and began hauling in the nets. The winch strained, always a good sign, usually meant the nets had caught something substantial. For just a moment, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this time. Maybe after all these months of failure, the ocean would finally give something back. The first net broke the surface. Empty. A few pieces of seaweed tangled in the mesh. One small fish, undersized, that he'd have to throw back. Nothing else. Of course. Marcus wanted to scream, to rage at the sky, to curse God and the ocean and his own stupid persistence. But he just stood there, rain running down his face, and hauled in the worthless net. Then the second net, also empty except for debris and a couple of tiny fish. Then the third net. Nothing. $18 worth of fish, maybe, if he was lucky. Barely enough to cover a fraction of the fuel he'd burned getting out here. Another complete waste. Another failure added to the mountain. Marcus stood on the deck of the Mary Catherine in the middle of a storm that was trying to kill him, and felt something inside him finally break. Not dramatically, not with rage or tears, just a quiet snapping sound, internal and final. The sound of a man giving up, of hope dying completely, of faith turning to ash. He was done. Done fighting. Done trying. Done pretending any of this mattered. The ocean had won. Life had won. He'd lost, and it was time to accept that reality and figure out how to surrender with whatever dignity remained. Marcus began securing the nets for the return journey, moving automatically, his mind strangely calm now that he'd made the decision to quit. He'd sell the Mary Catherine, might get 30 or 40,000 for her, enough to pay off some debts, if not all. He'd declare bankruptcy, let the house go, find some minimum wage job, and start over with nothing. His mother would have to go to a state facility. Emma would learn to cope with a father who'd failed at everything. Sarah would be right about him. Everyone would be right about him. And that was okay. That was actually a relief, in a weird way. The fighting could stop. The hoping could stop. He could just exist, broken but at peace with being broken. Marcus was about to start the engine for the long trip back to shore when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A human voice, barely audible over the wind and rain, calling out. Weak, desperate, unmistakably real. He froze, listening. There it was again, someone yelling for help, the cry nearly swallowed by the storm, but definitely there. No way. This far from shore? In this weather? Nobody else would be stupid enough to be out here. He was imagining things, storm-induced hallucination, exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But the cry came again, more urgent this time. And Marcus, despite everything, despite his decision to give up, despite his better judgment, found himself scanning the rough seas for the source. There, about 200 yards off the starboard side. Something in the water. Hard to make out through the rain and waves, but definitely something. A person, maybe, clinging to what looked like a piece of debris. A human being, fighting to survive in water that would kill them in minutes. Faith. Not blind faith that ignored reality. But faith that maybe, just maybe, the universe wasn't as cold and uncaring as he'd believed. He motored back to Rockport Harbor slowly, his mind reeling. The sun was fully up now, the day bright and clear, and Marcus Thompson felt like he was seeing the world for the first time in months. Really seeing it. The beauty of the coastline, the possibility in each wave, the gift of being alive. At the harbor, Tommy was waiting, and his eyes went wide when he saw the deck of the Mary Catherine. Holy Marcus, what the hell? Where did all this come from? You wouldn't believe me if I told you, Marcus said, and he was smiling, actually smiling, for the first time in what felt like years. The fish sold for more than Marcus had imagined. Jerry Morrison took the whole catch, paid premium prices, and didn't ask questions about the sudden reversal of fortune. The diamond ring, appraised at a jeweler in Portland, turned out to be worth $78,000, more than enough to pay off the mortgage arrears, clear the business loans, cover his mother's nursing home bill, catch up on child support, and still have money left over for Emma's birthday present. Within 2 weeks, Marcus's life had transformed. Not magically. He still had to work, still had to rebuild, but the crushing weight was lifted. He could breathe again. He could plan again. He could hope again. His mother lived another month, passing peacefully in her sleep at Seaside, with Marcus holding her hand and the bills paid in full. In her last moments of clarity, she'd smiled at him and said, "I knew you'd figure it out, sweetheart. I always knew." Sarah agreed to let Emma spend more time with him, seeing that Marcus had stabilized, that he was present and engaged and no longer drowning. They'd never get back together. That chapter was closed, but they could be good co-parents. They could raise their daughter together, even if separately. Emma's 8th birthday party was everything she deserved. Marcus bought her the art supplies she'd been wanting, and she spent the entire day drawing pictures of boats and fish, and a mysterious man with kind eyes who Emma said looked like someone Daddy would know. Marcus returned to church, slipping in quietly one Sunday morning and sitting in the back pew. Reverend Mitchell saw him, smiled, and didn't make a big deal about his return. After the service, they talked briefly, and Marcus found himself telling the story. The storm, the stranger, the impossible catch, the ring. "Sounds like you met an angel," Reverend Mitchell said simply. "Or I hallucinated the whole thing," Marcus replied, though he didn't believe that. "Does it matter which? The result is the same. You found your way back to faith. You remembered who you are. That's what matters." Marcus started taking Emma fishing on weekends, teaching her the things his father had taught him. She loved it, loved being on the water with her dad, loved learning about tides and fish, and the language of the sea. And sometimes, when the morning light hit the waves just right, Marcus could swear he saw Michael standing at the bow of the boat, smiling just for a moment before vanishing again. He never told anyone the full story, not even Tommy, who knew something had happened but respected Marcus's silence. Some things were too sacred, too personal, too impossible to share without diminishing them. But Marcus Thompson, fisherman from Rockport, Maine, father and son and man who'd almost given up entirely, never forgot the lesson that October morning taught him: that miracles are real, that hope is never wasted, that faith, real faith, isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting that you're not alone, even in the darkest moments. It's about believing that rescue can come from unexpected places. It's about remembering that one act of compassion, one moment of choosing kindness over convenience, can change everything. And that sometimes, when you save someone else, you end up saving yourself. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that miracles still happen and faith still matters, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment sharing your own story of unexpected blessing or divine intervention. Give this a like if you believe that hope is never lost, even in our darkest moments. And share it with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone, that rescue is coming, that the God who knows their name hasn't forgotten them. Because Marcus Thompson's story isn't just his story. It's a reminder for all of us that when we stop looking for what we need in all the wrong places and start looking inside ourselves, at our capacity for compassion, our willingness to help others, our stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up makes sense, that's when the real miracle happens. Amen. Glory to God. May you find your own miracle just when you need it most.